All right, 6 o'clock. Esther, chapter 4. Again, I've been having a blast doing this. This has been fun for me. It's been interesting doing it this way, as opposed to doing a Bible study and down at the church or at our house or something like that. But it's been a cool thing, and allow me to pray real fast for us and pray for the message, and then we'll just dive into it. Lord, again, as I always say, I thank you for this time. I thank you for this opportunity for us to do this. I thank you for the circumstances that have brought it about. They may not seem like things to be thankful for, but Lord, you're going to do amazing things through this, and I know it. And I just thank you for everything that you do. And I ask, Lord, that you just would use my words tonight, bless the preparation that I put into this and the time, and hopefully, well, as always, your will be done, and hopefully this message is timely and helpful. Okay, so the book of Esther, we're starting chapter 4, and so far what's happened, just as a real quick catch-up, the king of Persia, Xerxes, had basically fired his queen. He basically sent her away, said she could never be in his presence again because she refused to come and present herself before a bunch of guys that, they were having a big shindig and a big party, and he wanted her to show off her beauty. And they had been partying for days, literally, and she refused to do it. And because they were concerned with, the men were concerned with how the women of their own women in their own homes and in their own towns, where all the leaders were concerned with how the women were going to react to this. They can't have the queen disobeying the king, so they basically got rid of her. They shoot her away, and she was no longer ever to be in the presence of the king. And the idea was to replace the queen, and so they had this little bit of a beauty contest of sorts. And the women in Persia were brought in before the king, and they had to prepare for a year just to be brought in before her with all kinds of perfumes and oils and treatments. And at the end of it, the hero of our story, Esther, was the one who won the king's heart. The idea was to pick the best one. It was like not a talent show or a beauty contest, but it would literally be like one of those television shows where, a reality show where all these women were competing to be the next queen. And Esther is a Jew. And she was in Persia because years earlier, a lot of literally hundreds of thousands of Jews were displaced. They were captured by the Babylonians, brought to Babylon, and they were retrained there and kept there as, it's weird that they had freedom, but they still were slaves. It was an interesting thing. They retrained them in the gods they worshiped. They retrained them in the food they ate and in all of their daily activities. So after a period of time, what ended up happening is Babylon was captured by the Medo-Persians. And now that's what's going on is the Medo-Persians are in control, and the king of Persia happens to be this guy, King Xerxes. And that's where we begin our process. What had happened earlier was we were introduced to several characters. Esther's uncle, Mordecai, who had saved the king against a plot and told Esther about it. And Esther had, informed the king that this plot was happening. And Mordecai never got credit for it, but it was one of the first things Esther did was she let the king know, hey, there's a plot against your life. And they pointed that out. Then we met this guy, Haman. Haman is kind of just an arch enemy of Mordecai, but Haman was lifted to the highest level in the government. King Xerxes honored him in a way that no one else was honored, and he was put in a position of just only person above him was King Xerxes. Okay, and because of the fact that Haman and Mordecai had a long history and were kind of mortal enemies, there was a rule that went out that everyone was to bow and show the respect to Haman, and only one guy wouldn't do it. It was Mordecai. Mordecai would not bow before Haman. And so therefore Haman got really irritated by the whole thing and didn't just stop at wanting to have Mordecai killed. He decided he was going to actually commit genocide and get rid of every single Jew that lived in Persia. Literally kill all of them. He got the king to sign off on this, and he issued an edict, and they gave a date in the near future that when it was going to happen. Not only was every Jew going to be killed, but also all of the spoils of their households were going to belong to the people who killed them. So you probably had a very large group of people who were willing to do the work anyway, simply because there was a big paycheck in it for them. And that's where we left off. Is this edict was passed, and the people in the capital city were stunned. But the king and Haman were kicking back, having drinks. It's like, hey, it's cool. This is what we're going to do. All right? So now we start in chapter 4. But before we dig into this, I want to point out a couple of things for us to kind of think about. Years earlier, the Jews that were still in Persia had been given the opportunity to return to Jerusalem. But of the million or so, there's a lot of different, I've read a lot of different things about how many Jews actually were in Persia at the time. Only a small percentage of them actually returned because they had the opportunity to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, restore worship, and renew the nation of Israel again. But only a small portion of them went back. And many of them stayed behind in Persia, where they had been slaves in the past, and they were now living lives. They were prosperous, they had families, they had businesses, and they chose not to return to the land of their heritage, to go back and rebuild the temple because it was in shambles, and restore their worship of the true and living God. They chose to stay and live out their lives. And it's an interesting fact or thought, okay, that God did not forsake them. Now, so far in our story, we haven't seen God doing anything. We haven't even seen God's name mentioned, okay? But we see the workings behind the scene, and we know, since this is, we know who was putting this all together, we know that God is involved, but they don't even mention his name in the book, all right? But the fact is, we can look at these people and their decisions, and we can think of our own lives. Maybe not as extreme as this, but think about times in our lives when we have made decisions to, I don't want to say backslide, because that indicates more of a, start living a life, marked by sin. I mean, we never stop sinning. It's not something that, Christians are not free of sin. They're just forgiven of it. And, we are changed as our lives go forward, but that's not the kind of thing I'm talking about here. How many times have we been through a season in our lives where we don't serve, where we don't spend any time, actually in prayer? We don't spend time worshiping. We don't spend the time doing the things that bring us closer to God because we're busy. We have a season in our lives where our lives are just consumed by our personal goals and ambitions. And I don't want to downplay those things. Those are important. I've raised 7 kids. That has been a major project. I've had to take care of 7 kids and, for the last 25 years. And it's called me away from doing the things, that I would always want to do. Okay. And sometimes I find myself, months will go by and I'm not serving the Lord. And I also find that during those times, I'm not in the Word. I get away from doing that. And frankly, and I've shared this with my own family, I've shared it with Pastor Mike on a couple of occasions, the biggest reason, not the only reason, but one of the biggest reasons, I should put it, that I actually do these studies and that I teach on Sundays when I'm given the opportunity, and why I love to teach, is because it puts me in a position where I have to study the Word. I got to prepare for the message. And I'm always blessed by that. And I can watch the course of my life as I go through periods where I'm not doing it, and things just kind of go sideways on me, whether that's just mentally or whether that's things in my personal life. But when I'm not studying, I find that things go sideways. But whenever I start again, it's just like taken up right where I left off. And the point I want to make with that is God does not forget us, even though for a period we might forsake him. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 15 and 16 say something really cool. It says this: "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I, says the Lord, will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me." To me, that is amazing. The fact that we can be unfaithful and the fact that we can step away because we allow things in our lives. Sometimes they're just bad things, or sometimes we just get busy, but we can step away and he never forsakes us. It's just like I said, it's like taking up right where we left off, waiting for us. I love that, and this is a picture of that, because as this story goes on, we're going to see how God's working behind the scenes. He's hard at work here. And these people have chosen to forsake going back and starting up worship again. They've chosen to forsake going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple and renewing their nation. They have chosen their lives and their jobs and those things because they've decided those are more important. Well, they're going to find out that those things are not that important and they're not very permanent as we read more in the story, because the edict was put out to kill every one of them. Okay, so anyway, let's start in chapter 1, or verse 1. When Mordecai, Esther's uncle, learned of all that had been done, in other words, when he read the edict that said all Jews were to be exterminated, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he only went as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. What's this deal with sackcloth and ashes? Well, sackcloth is like goat skin turned inside out, very rough. The idea was to make yourself uncomfortable. And then what Jews would do when they were going through a period of time where they were mourning, or sometimes they did it when they were in repentance, but most often you see it when they're in mourning, they would either sprinkle ashes on their head or they would sit in a pile of ashes. Remember that Job did that when his family was all killed. He sat in a big pile of ashes and scraped his boils with pieces of pottery. I always wondered what the ashes were all about, but I'm assuming it's going to be a similar thing, where it's representative of their mourning. And it brings me to ask a question here. The picture is Mordecai is just losing it. He's put on sackcloth and ashes. He can't go into the king's gate. Many Jews are doing the exact same thing. And they're mourning right now. They're experiencing grief over the news that they are about to be exterminated. And that is a very good reason. And given the fact that there's probably about 1 million of these guys, I wonder if it ever occurred to them where, well, you know what? They could probably just say, we're out of here. What are you going to do? Stop us? But that isn't discussed here, so it's just something to think about, okay? But how do we handle grief? Especially when we see, not just in our own lives, but when we have a brother and sister or just a friend or someone like that who is experiencing grief. And I wanted to comment on that for a moment. Generally, grief comes at the loss of a loved one. Sometimes we grieve over a loss of a relationship, like a failed marriage, or just we grieve over things of that nature. But usually grief is associated with death. And what do you say? I mean, internally, how do you process that? How are we supposed to process it? And what do you say to someone who's in the middle of that? And I don't want to say this is a set way of doing it for everybody that you run into, because it might be different for different folks. But I've often found that when you are facing someone, a friend, brother or sister in Christ, just a person who is experiencing grief and is embroiled in the middle of it, sometimes saying just nothing is probably the best idea. I mean, what we want to do, we want to break out quotes. We want to be able to quote the Bible and say, all things working together for good for those who love the Lord. But as a person who's experienced grief, I don't want to hear anything. But what I do want is I want someone to cry with me. I want someone to be there with me, just to put their hand on my shoulder, just to sit next to me. And sometimes that's the greatest thing that you can do for someone who is grieving, is just be there for them. That doesn't mean just sitting there and crying with them, but tending to their needs. Finding out, hey, well, because just because someone's in grief doesn't mean that their need to take care of their family or the need to continue operating on a daily basis doesn't go away. But what a blessing it is as a congregation when we reach out and we send people out to cook meals for people who are, sometimes we do it for people who've just had a baby, and that's wonderful. There's no grief there, but we should do the same thing for individuals who are grieving, because again, it'd be nice to be able to say words that make them feel better and fix the situation, but you can't do that. Sometimes it's best just to be there with them. And if you are the one experiencing the grief, that period of time can probably feel more like the time when you are the furthest away from God than you will ever experience. I recall years ago when I first started getting involved with the idea of sharing the gospel on Facebook. It didn't turn out so well for me. I find doing it in person. I'm doing it now, but the point is, I had an interaction with a woman who claimed to be a believer and lost a child. And she just could not comprehend how a God could exist that would allow that kind of thing. And so therefore, she just professed to be an atheist. I'm not going to have anything to do with a God who would allow this to happen. For those of us who know the Lord, we understand that we're in a fallen world. We understand already what He's done for us, that any grief that we experience, He's in it with us, and that He's already given His Son's life for us. But a person who doesn't know the Lord, it's almost impossible to take comfort in that. So as Christians, we need to take comfort in what I just said, that verse where I said, I'm going to go back and read it again, where it says, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. I can't think of anything more comforting than reminding myself of that during a period of time where I might be grieving. Anyway, I wanted to talk about that for a moment. The way these guys are dealing with is they're wearing sackcloth and they're pouring ashes on their head and sitting on piles of ashes. And then going to verse 4, it says, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. He didn't want to do a cover-up. He just, no, I'm going to continue grieving this way. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. See, notice that the queen didn't even know about this decree to have all of the Jews wiped out. She was unaware of it. She just knew her uncle Mordecai was greatly grieved, and she wanted to know what's the deal. So in verse 6 it says, so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. See, not only were there individuals who were going to be, the ones who were going to do the killing were going to get paid, but they also were going to get to keep the spoils of all the Jews' households. This was going to be a bloodbath. And for a moment, I want to remind you that this is not a fairy tale. This happened, okay? This is historical. I can't even comprehend living in a place where all of a sudden they announce that they are going to not only wipe out all of a certain group of people, but that amount of people, even one person's bad, but 1 million? And they're okay with this? It really shows the depravity of this king. It shows the depravity of Haman, of these people, the king who would okay it. And how can a human being be okay with killing 1 million people? I am just shocked by that. A lot of times we read these stories from the Old Testament and we look at them as stories and they think, oh, they represent meanings and, we take meaning out of this. No. That's making it a little bit like a fairy tale. This happened. And these people were going through this event. They were dealing with the fact that they were going to be completely exterminated, and there were people who were ready to kill them for money. Haman wanted to do it for pride because of the fact that he was offended by the fact that, Mordecai wouldn't worship him. He wanted to kill 1 million people. Man. Mordecai also gave, verse 8, a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, the capital city, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Remember, she has not disclosed that she's a Jew yet. So he's saying, you need to go let the king know that you're a Jew and you need to beg and plead for mercy. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to go back to Mordecai and say, all of the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I, Esther, was called to go to the king. She's basically saying, hey, you're putting me in a place where I have to face a decision that's probably going to cost me my life. To go before the king without being invited to go there, even though I'm his wife, was punishable by death. And if the king chose not to extend the gold scepter, I imagine there was this scepter sitting by his throne, and if someone came in uninvited, he would either stretch it out and say, you live, or nope, don't do it, take him away, kill him. I'm not sure how it worked out. But the point is, if he didn't choose to extend the gold scepter to her, he wasn't going to listen to her petition at all. Nothing was going to change. He wouldn't hear a word she had to say. He would have her taken away and killed, and they still all would be facing annihilation. No change. All Esther is doing is letting Mordecai know this isn't really the best plan, perhaps, because of the fact that it's probably not going to affect anything. Well, for a moment before we move on, I want us to think about the relationship that we have with our king. Okay? This guy, Xerxes, wouldn't allow you to come before him. He had the ability and the power to completely control everyone's lives. And if he decided you were to die, whether he was just or not, guess what? You're dead. That was the world that these people lived in. Now, we live in a different world, and we do have a king. Okay, and I'm not talking about our government. I'm talking about Jesus Christ. I want to read you a couple of verses that talks about the relationship that we have with him. The first one is Matthew 11:28. where it says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Meaning, we have the invitation. We don't have to wait for the invitation. That invitation has already been printed in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. We are invited to go to him, everyone. Hebrews 4:16 goes on and says, "Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." So not only are we given an invitation, but we are to approach his throne with confidence. Now, why do we approach the king's throne? Because we need something. We want something. We desire something. We require something. We are to petition him, and we're invited to do so. This is almost the exact opposite as the situation that she had. And understand something, this was very similar to their relationship with God, that they didn't even have a temple there. They were out of Jerusalem. The temple was in shambles. And prior to the coming of Christ, people that were even believers didn't have the ability to just approach God and petition him. This is how important what Christ did is he created the ability for us to go before the King without fear, with invitation, with welcome, and ask him for what we need. And at the end of the day, he's the only one that can give us all the things that we need. That's exactly what we need. Our relationship with the King is perfect. But sometimes we just don't approach the throne. How often do you approach the throne? Do we only do it in a kind of half-hearted way or do we wait till we're extremely stressed and pressured? Or do we approach the throne as often? I mean, think about it. An invitation like that is not something that comes along every day. That's an invitation we as Christians should be going before his throne daily. Heck, we should be going before his throne hourly. There's no better place to be. Just treasure that you have, that obviously Esther and these folks did not have. Well, in verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Mordecai, despite the fact that he's mourning and weeping, maybe he doesn't see the whole thing. He has confidence that relief and deliverance will come from somewhere. Now, I believe Mordecai was a godly man. I believe he still prayed, even though it doesn't mention in this book that he did. I believe he had faith in God, but he still was mourning over the situation. But he was telling Esther, he's going, look, you have the opportunity to do something here. And the reality is, whether or not you do it, you're going to die. They're going to find out that you're a Jew, and they're going to kill you. Now, you have the opportunity to allow yourself to be used. You have the opportunity to involve yourself in the work of God. And as Christians, we need to look at this. Many times we sit back and say, well, someone else will handle that. Oh, that's something for the church to deal with. Guys, hey, we're the church, remember? And when opportunities come up for us to step into people's lives, even if there's a high cost, we have to remember the blessing and not withhold ourselves, because we have to remember perhaps we were put in this situation we're in now, in this place, in this time, exactly for a thing such as this. Perhaps God wants to use you in somebody's life, whether that's one person's life or 1,000,000 people's lives. We can choose to stay silent, and do nothing, or we can choose to be used. And this is the exact same question that Mordecai is posting to Esther. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. They weren't texting. I imagine it was a eunuch running back and forth because they didn't have phones. He says this to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went out and carried all of Esther's instructions. So, right on, 6:30. Next week, chapter 5. What do I wrap this up with? Well, I think most importantly, and this is summarizing the whole book too, is that despite the fact that we from time to time will forsake God, he will not forsake us. And yes, I realize so far through chapter 4, God hasn't shown up. At least we haven't seen him and God stepped in and did this or did that. But we know he's working behind the scenes. And when everything is said and done, we'll get to see what he did. So you need to remember that. No matter what stage you are in your life, whether it's because you feel totally separated from God through grief and just hardship that might be just crushing you, he's got you written in the palm of his hand. He's not going to forget you. Will he allow you to go through periods of time like this? Yes, he will. I'm not going to promise you that life is going to be some rosy, wonderful thing. No, we're going to go through trials and tribulations. We're going to lose loved ones. We're going to lose relationships. Bad stuff's going to happen. But through all of that, God never forsakes us. Ever, ever, ever. And you need to remember that. We also need to remember that as Christians, we're given the opportunity to serve in a time like this. What are you waiting for? That's what Mordecai would say to you. He'd say, you know what? What's going to happen is going to happen. Step up. Maybe you are in this position now for just this exact reason. Now, obviously, we're not being threatened extermination yet, okay? But we do have a lot of hurting people. There are a lot of people out there that need some support, that need some help. They need to hear a kind word. Whatever it is that you can offer, don't withhold it. Because maybe you were put in this position for just such a thing as this. I want to thank you. I hope you enjoyed the message. We'll be back next Wednesday night at 6 o'clock for chapter 5. I encourage you to read it in advance. It always makes it a little bit easier. I just ask for the Lord's blessing on all of your lives. I hope things is going well. I really, once again, I've said this every week for the last 4 weeks, looking forward to seeing you all again, and not on a computer screen, but live and in person. Hopefully that's something that's going to be happening soon. And I just want to let you know that I love all of you, care about all of you, and I'm praying for each and every one of you. God bless you, and you guys take care of yourselves. Bye.